So thank you everyone for joining us today for the JACC author interview. I'm Dr. Chen, Associate Editor at JACC. Today, it's my great pleasure to speak with Dr. Jicheng Gong and Dr. Tong Zhu for their paper published in JACC entitled Associations of Short-Term Ozone Exposure with Hypoxia and Arterial Stiffness. So Dr. Gong is Associate Professor and Department Chair at the Department of Environmental Health, College of Environmental Science and Engineering at Peking University. Professor Zhu is a professor and former dean of the College of the Environmental Sciences and Engineering at Peking University. He's also a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So Dr. Zhong and Dr. Zhu, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And congratulations to you and your co-authors for publishing such an important work in JACC.
Thank you. Yeah, we're happy to have this opportunity to share what we have found.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So what motivates your study to examine the association between short-term ozone exposure, hypoxia, and arterial stiffness?
So I think it's a long story, but we can keep it short. About 23 years ago, when we went to mountain areas in Tibet, Plateau, and at the base camp, we observed the ozone concentration was extremely high, up to 80 to 90 ppb. At that level, it's about 5,200 meters above sea levels. So that surprised us to ask the question, where does the ozone come from? So we published a paper, we believe, because it's the glacial wind bring the air from the upper troposphere and down to the surface, leading to the higher ozone. But the second question comes, what would that impact on our health? Because we are actually already exposed to the high altitude and low oxygen level. So that has been a question at this level, high ozone, what could impact on our health? This is one side story. Another one is ozone has been an air pollutant there for a long time. A lot of studies found it's a strong association with cardiovascular disease. But can we understand the mechanism and how to explain this association has been a challenge for us. And starting in 2017, we had opportunity to join the second expedition to the Tibetan Plateau, scientific expedition to the Tibetan Plateau. And we are fortunate to bring up the question together. First, to understand if the ozone could influence on human beings at high altitude, or is any different. And the second, because at Tibetan Plateau, we have higher ozone, but much less PM and other pollutants. Can we study the ozone itself impact on human health? So these issues gradually evolved. And one important thing is Professor Jicheng Gong has proposed a hypothesis because we are starting to explore the hypoxia at high altitude, but then he suggests ozone could also impact on human health through the hypoxia, and then so that started our study design. So that's I think my response to your question, and maybe Professor Jicheng Gong could also add more information.
Yes, thank you, Professor Zhu. And as you said, I really appreciate we can have this campaign, this very unique opportunities for us to investigate the cardiovascular effect of ozone. Yeah.
So thank you for sharing this. I find it fascinating because the study design is really unique. You got into Tibetan Plateau at such high latitude to do such very cool study where you can actually compare, two different cities at different altitudes. So I wonder, like, your study has shown this kind of fascinating findings on this novel mechanism, really linking ozone-induced hypoxia as the critical mechanism between ozone exposure and cardiovascular diseases. So I wonder, for example, Professor Gong, can you elaborate more on these novel biological mechanisms? So what are the key findings you have?
Yeah, our study uncovered a novel biological mechanism linking short-term ozone exposure to cardiovascular damage, with the hypoxia serving as a key pathogenic factor in this relationship. We identified several interconnected pathways and effects. First, our study demonstrated ozone exposure activates the HIF-1 signaling pathway, which is critical for the cellular adaptation to hypoxia. And the ozone exposure increased HIF-1 alpha expression at the mRNA and the protein levels, enhanced the transcriptional activity, and upregulate the target genes. And think this is the might be the first human studies to establish a direct link between ozone exposure and HIF-1 activation. Previously, the studies shown in animal models to influence the vascular remodeling, inflammation, and oxidative stress. And the second, we found the short-term ozone exposure reduced peripheral oxygen saturation, indicating the systemic hypoxia. It also increased the red blood cell count, hemoglobin, and hematocrit, which reflect the compensatory responses to the low oxygen availability. However, these changes may elevate blood viscosity and contribute to the cardiovascular issues such as the arterial stiffness. So we further investigate the ozone exposure. We found ozone exposure was linked to the increased arterial stiffness measured by PWV, the pulse wave velocity. The PWV is a predictor of a cardiovascular disease. So the reduced oxygen saturation and the elevated red blood cell count, hemoglobin, partially mediated by this relationship, which suggests the hypoxia-induced vascular damage through the mechanism like increased blood viscosity, altered the lipid metabolism and inflammation. So these insights provide us a robust evidence based for the public health strategies and identify maybe potential targets for early interventions to mitigate the cardiovascular risk of ozone exposure.
Wonderful. So I think, your study really did way beyond what the normal hypothesis going. Just some things we make hypothesis that reduce oxygen saturation or elevated levels of red blood cell count, etc. These are kind of things that we read from the literature. But the HIF-1 pathway activation, in your study you did from the mRNA expression to the protein activity, transcription to the target gene expression, the full pathway activation I found is fascinating. But even more fascinating is that you also did this mediation analysis that as we just explained. So I think this new evidence is really convincing, showing that this kind of novel biological pathway that you have proposed. I do have a follow-up question on this because when in epidemiology, especially environmental epidemiology, when we look at evidence linking short-term ozone exposure and cardiovascular health effects, there are many studies showing the increased risk for cardiovascular mortality outcomes. But in the US Environmental Protection Agency's 2020 Integrated Science Assessment Report, it only classified the current evidence on the ozone's short-term effects on the cardiovascular system as suggesting but insufficient to infer causality. And one of that reason, the report is contributing to the inconsistent findings that people will show some positive, some protective effects from some controlled human exposure studies. I know your research group also has done some controlled human exposure studies before. So my question for you is, so what does this particular study why is uniquely positioned to address this research question compared to previous controlled human exposure studies?
Yeah, thank you for this question. While many epi studies have documented the adverse cardiovascular effect of short-term ozone exposure, as you mentioned, the 2020 US EPA Integrated Science Assessment categorized the evidence of ozone as suggestive but insufficient to infer causality. And this limitation arises, at least in part, from inconsistent findings in controlled human exposure studies, which often involve constrained exposure time and artificial chamber settings. And these conditions fail to fully replicate the complexities of real-world environments and may underestimate the cumulative effect of ozone exposure. In addition, the presence of confounding factors in observational studies, such as cold pollutant like PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide, has further complicated the efforts to isolate the independent effect of ozone on cardiovascular health. So our study uniquely addresses these gaps by investigating ozone exposure in a real-world setting. So we conducted in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, where ozone levels are naturally elevated and the coal pollutant concentration remain minimal. So our study provide an ideal environment to evaluate the independent effect of ozone on the cardiovascular health. And the participants experienced prolonged and natural variations in ozone exposure, which allow us to capture its cumulative impacts. And also, our panel study design incorporate the repeated measurement for each individuals, which enable us to get a rigorous control of those confounding variables, enhancing the robustness of our finding. So this approach not only complements controlled experimental studies, but also underscore the importance of a real-world investigation in providing the ecologically valid insights into the mechanism for us to understand ozone-related cardiovascular changes.
Thanks, Professor Gong. I think among all the strengths you mentioned in the study, one kind of really attracting unique strengths of the study is the elegant study design that you be able to find in such a place with natural high ozone pollution exposure, but a really low cold pollutant exposure, not only to PM2.5, but also many other anthropogenic regulated, normal regulated air pollutants. So I think this is really fascinating. But that does lead to the next follow-up question I want to ask Professor Zhu, actually. You mentioned this study is part of the large high altitude expedition on the Mount Everest or Chimolana. So could you share us more about this scientific expedition? What are your main goals for this? And what are more exciting findings you have for this expedition?
Yes. Yeah, this is great because Tibetan Plateau is the largest plateau and highest, with average about 4,000 meters above sea levels. So there are about a few million inhabitants living there. And there's also a strong interaction with the other parts, like through the monsoon or westerly interactions. So there's a lot of challenging scientific question, especially with the background of global climate change. And the temperature over the Tibetan Plateau also increased much faster. So because of so many questions are there, so the Chinese government has funded the second, we had the first one before, now is the second scientific expedition to the Tibetan Plateau. And then it has more than 10,000 participants joining us to explore almost all aspects from the nature science perspective. And to the mountain Everest, we know that's the summit on the Earth. And it's so remote. but it's also strongly influenced by human activity because the temperature there also increases much faster and the glacier retreat back to where a huge impact through this human activities. So there's one question kept in our mind is because in the year 2001 we found very high ozone. So are they still continuously still are there, or is this annual things happening there? So during the second expedition, we had so many questions regarding ozone. Where does it come from, and how would the impact on human health, and if there is synergic effect of higher ozone and lower oxygen. So because this hypoxia may have a synergic effect from this too. So by the year 2022, we have this again the summit expedition to the Mountain Everest, and for us, our team was trying to find out if ozone concentration still high, and where does it come from. And so we put a lot of ground measurements and also ozone sounding. And what make us excited about this, ozone concentration were still high. And so this is almost annually high concentration over there. And through the ozone sounding, we found that with increased altitude, the ozone concentration also increased. That suggests the intrusion of higher ozone in the stratosphere or ozone layer was responsible for the higher ozone on the surface in Tibetan Plateau. So this is what makes us understanding more why this place has higher ozone. And another thing we had did a study on the human health with higher ozone and also at altitude 5,200 meters above sea level, hypoxia could also have strong impact. So our target was to understand the mechanism and also where is the synergic effect of higher ozone and also the lack of oxygen because of high altitude. So there are many exciting findings. I can keep on going, but
and that's all sounds very exciting. Yeah, yes. Thank you so much. I think at the end of this interview, I do want to mention that this is one of the few JACC papers we published with authors from mainland China. So very excited, and as such, I want to ask you a question in Chinese. So what are the questions or things that you want to highlight that we haven't discussed in this conversation? 谢谢周彤老师和龚清春老师今天能够参加我们 JACC 的这个 interview。我想问的是，就是说，除了我们今天涉及到的一些问题，还有什么其他的方面？就是这个文章以及你们在做这个文章以及整体的这个研究设计的时候，有什么你们想跟大家所分享的？
朱老师您先说。
龚老师你先说。
好的好的，感谢陈凯老师啊，因为这个研究是在青藏高原开展的啊，平均海拔在3000以上了。那我们这两个研究，一个是在拉萨，一个是在林芝，一个海拔3650，一个海拔是接近3000。当时我们基本上是发动了全系的力量来开展这个研究，整个的研究过程是非常非常艰苦的。在青藏高原，它相当于是从零开始啊，我们从搭建这个采样的平台，然后去入组人群，去采样，然后学生在克服着这个高原反应的过程当中啊，本身是要克服自身的这样的一个很严重的高原反应啊。然后还要高质量的完成工作，所以我想表达的意思就是我们这个 panel study 其实是完成的，过程是非常艰难的，但是非常幸运的是， 我们发现了很有意思的结果啊，我们发现这个Ozone 它对人的心血管健康很 consistent 的一个影响，而且我们发现一个很 novel 的一个机制啊，通过影响缺氧，然后来造成这个心血管健康的损伤，所以我们非常的兴奋啊，也很高兴有机会跟 JACC 合作，能把这个结果发表在 JACC 上啊。好，谢谢啊。
朱老师您讲两句。
好的，特别感谢啊，陈侃老师，特别感谢 Jack 给我们这个机会跟更大的那个来分享我们的在心脏高原研究的发现。那么这个发现呢，实际上我们当然像你刚刚讲的，我们还有很多很让人兴奋的一些工作还在进行。那我们主要是原来就是因为刚开始我们主要是想看休养对人体健康的影响，那么利用青藏高原这样一个特殊环境。那么刚才讲的还有另外一个呢，就是说青藏高原本身它也是一个缺氧环境，所以呢，在人体长期缺氧，它有它的适应性。那么这个适应性在叠加上到我们的休养的影响的时候，它的适应性会怎么样发生变化？它的平衡状态会发生什么样的变化？这是我们很想了解的。那么除此之外呢，它们有没有协同效应，更加剧我们的这种影响？所以这是一个。另外，当然我们还在研究，就是高原缺氧的时候，对我们心血管系统是会产生更加不利的影响的原因是什么？特别是呢，现在有越来越多的人去西藏去旅游、去工作、去做科考。那么我们短期进去的人，我们能不能适应高原缺氧和休氧的暴露？以及回到平原以后呢，我们是不是能够大部分都能恢复到正常的情况？所以这是有很多我们的新的一些问题和发现。所以我们也很期待着有更多的机会和能够跟更多的这个你关注的人分享。谢谢陈刚老师。
谢谢朱老师，谢谢龚老师。就是整体的这个研究的这个设计，还有您刚刚讲的这个，是让人非常的兴奋，也非常的这个钦佩。我觉得就是能够这么艰苦的环境，然后做出这么重要而且非常有科学意义的发现，我觉得是很值得大家钦佩的。那这样的话，我想今天我们可能就到这儿，然后我转成英文跟大家说再见。So thank you again, Professor Zhu and Professor Gong, for sharing your insights, especially behind the scenes stories and some in Chinese, but this very important work. And thank you all for joining us today. Congratulations for publishing JACC.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Dr. Chen.